How many Penn State fans do we have here in the room? Good. I just wanted to make sure that we were among friendly people here.
I was gonna wear my Ohio State hoodie just to piss some people off, but I decided against it. My wife taught me.
I was going to ask about Ohio State people. I forgot that I had one sitting here right next to me.
I got nothing to do with that stuff, man. I love my school. I don't care about the football team.
Well, I appreciate you all coming out on a Tuesday night. I've spent like the last 3 years with this book sort of inside my head, talking to my poor wife and my 2 sons about it and how excited I was about it. And both of them are, 3 of them, I'm sorry, are really tired of hearing about it right now. So I'm glad you all came out to hear about it yourselves. I appreciate it. It's been sort of a labor of love, but it is, you're sitting by yourself, week after week, sort of conducting these interviews. The book is in my head, and then it comes out, and it takes almost a year from when I handed it in. I handed it in like last September, I think.
It's been that long?
It's been, yeah. So it takes a while for a book to come out into the world. So this is literally the first place that I've actually seen it in the wild, and it's really exciting.
So it's like a birthing. It's like a pregnancy and a birthing.
It is.
All right.
If you take 3 years to kind of birth the whole thing, so I'm not sure
whether
that's an elephant or what
you
kind of.
You kept trying and trying, and then.
It. Anyway, it was a very sort of personal story for me. I am a 1987 graduate from Penn State. I worked for the student newspaper. That's where I first started my journalism career, the Daily Collegian. I see some friends from the Daily Collegian right here in the audience. I had, the good fortune to kind of cover Penn State football for sort of in the heyday of the program. I was there in 1986. Went to the Orange Bowl where they lost to Oklahoma in the national championship game.
You were at that?
I was there at that.
25-10, right?
25. Yes. They were not in it even from the start.
That was grim, wasn't it?
That was very grim.
Yeah, okay.
But they all decided to sort of come back, and I was there then in 1987 at the Fiesta Bowl when they won the national championship. So I saw, Paterno's teams in his heyday, but I also saw what those players were like when they came in as freshmen. And they, at that time, they actually lived in the dorms with you. So there were these giant monster offensive linemen that lived on my dorm room floor. And I saw, the transformation, as they came in as like sort of young high school kids and as they left as young men. And that whole notion of like success with honor and what that meant at that time. So you can imagine when the Jerry Sandusky news broke, I was, heartbroken that such a horrific, series of crimes could happen here at Penn State, and what that would mean for the future of the program. And I actually had a friend at Esquire magazine where I had worked reach out to me and said, hey, do you want to write a piece for the website about this? Because he knew I was a Penn Stater. And the piece that I decided to write, in the first 48 hours was just about that sort of Joe Paterno that I knew, right? That standard that he had set for the program and for his players. And the idea that could be lost because of these crimes of a monster, right? The idea that whole thing could be tossed out was just crushing for me. And I took a lot of heat for that story. It was posted on Facebook. I had a lot of people kind of reaching out that just sort of didn't understand Penn State. They couldn't sort of appreciate why people would have such a passion for Joe Paterno. And so flash forward to, 2012, when, Joe Paterno was gone and the athletic director was let go and the president of the university was let go, and Joe Paterno sort of dies in February of 2012, and Bill O'Brien comes in, and these sort of players go through a winter workouts with him, and I think that you feel like maybe the storm has passed, and cut to July, the NCAA decides to sort of step in and issue sanctions against the program, and reduce the number of scholarships and issue a bowl ban. And for these kids who have sort of gone through that, I thought they had weathered the storm. They had a new coach. They had nothing to do with Jerry Sandusky. The last time he had coached in that program, they were in elementary school. And the NCAA, you could question how they did. I think it was probably out of a noble thought that they decided to absolve those students of whatever ties they had to Penn State, they were allowed to kind of transfer in an instant, but within minutes, their phones were ringing. Rival coaches were actually trying to recruit those kids away from the program. And so you're talking about 18, 19, 20-year-old students, athletes, who are looking there saying, like, is this whole thing going to collapse? Even those that were, Penn State proud, wanted to kind of stay there, are suddenly looking across the room saying, is there going to be an offensive line for me, to run behind? Is there going to be a quarterback that can kind of throw me the football? Are we going to have even enough players to to have a practice, much less a game in September? And so that was kind of the backdrop. And when those kids 48 hours later, called a press conference. In the time that I covered Penn State football, no player would have dared to call a press conference on their own, certainly under Joe Paterno.
That's a really good part of the book, too.
So that was the first thing that I thought was really remarkable, was that they were calling this press conference out there on their own. But when they came forward and said, like, hey, look, we're staying here. One man didn't build this program. One man's not going to tear this program down. As a lifetime fan and a long-time Penn State alum, that just really sort of struck me. I thought, finally, somebody's going to stand up here and defend the university. They don't have to defend, Jerry Sandusky. You don't have to defend Joe Paterno. They're basically saying this program matters. There's value to that program. And for me, it was just I was so thankful. And when they went on and won the Big Ten championship in 2016, and it was clear that the program was back on firm footing, I just thought, wow, that is really, you're talking about 18, 19, 20-year-olds. You're talking about a younger generation which people love to kind of trash because they think there's not enough grit, there's not enough courage, there's not enough fortitude there, and those kids exemplified that all the way through. And they made me proud, actually, to kind of see a team like that on the field representing not just Penn State, but college football. So that's just a little bit of background on what drew me to the story. I won't go through the whole thing for you because I want you to read it, number one. But I wanted to also then thank David Jones for coming out here after covering the program for 33 years. He recently retired. 35. He's here for one night only. We brought him out of retirement for one night only. But David, was there sort of in the trenches, right? I was kind of watching from home as the whole transition went through, and you were there. I mean, it had to be kind of crazy. It was pretty much, it felt like every day, if not every hour, that story was shifting.
Well, it actually goes back way into 2010 because... Let me make this clear right away. Sarah Ganem did all the heavy lifting on the Sandusky story. She did all of it. But there was a time before she got there. She didn't get to the Patriot News, to Penn Live, until December of 2010. Is that right? I think that's right. Yeah, December of 2010. And she had gotten sourcing on Sandusky months before that. And I had gotten a call, I'll never forget it, on August 12th, 2010, on Media Day, Penn State Media Day, driving up 322, that describing exactly what happened in the shower with Sandusky and the kid. I believe it was victim one. And he was never located before the criminal trial. And so those were the 3 counts out of the 47 that Jerry beat, because he didn't really want, he was located, but he did not want to show up at the criminal trial. He did show for the civil trial, and he got paid, but we were chasing him for a couple of months until I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I actually went to Jerry Sandusky's door about a week later when the news came down about the second mile, and I thought maybe he had been investigated. So I actually went to his door. It was in the middle of the season, like in October of 2010. And Dottie Sandusky came up and answered the door. And I didn't expect to find out anything, but I wanted to ask if police had been to the house and see what her reaction would be.
Okay.
because I didn't really know if what I was getting. When you get a tip, you don't know if it's real or what, but this was a very explicit tip from a very good source, dependable source. And Sarah wasn't at the paper yet. She was at the CDT in State College. I didn't have anybody else to confirm this, and we couldn't find the kid. And so I just wanted to see if law enforcement had been around. And it's pouring rain. They don't really have an awning in front of the Sandusky's house, and it's kind of an outskirts of State College. And I got my umbrella out there, but I must have looked pretty funny. And she said, yes. And I said, I'm Dave Jones. I used to know Jerry when he was on the staff. And keep in mind, I mean, he hasn't been on the staff for a decade. And she says, oh, yes. And I said, is he home? And she said, no, he's not here right now. I said, I must have sounded like Columbo, going, you know. I wanted to know if police have been around the house for any reason, asking you questions. And she immediately got very stiff. And she said, if you have any other questions, you go ask the second mile. I have nothing for you. And slammed the door in my face. And then I knew that something was up. I didn't know what. I knew that someone was investigating. And until Sarah came aboard, we really got nowhere with victim 1.
Right.
But she had, I think it was victim 7, the kid on the wrestling mat up in Snyder County or wherever it was. So she got the ball rolling, and the rest was history. But from that day that I got that tip, it really goes farther back. And it became just a maelstrom it was hard. And it affected my wife, affected my kid. And it's really 3 or 4 years of this stuff because you had this constant roiling argument about everything. And there were conspiracy theorists, there still are. And so, yeah, when you say the trenches, that was the trenches. And then when the presentment came down on November 5th, 2011, I mean, nobody had any idea exactly how explicit that was going to be.
Right. Yeah.
And I sat at my desk in the loft and just cried. I cried and thought, my God, this just thinking about it just gives me tremors.
Yep.
And I knew we were in for a long, crazy roller coaster ride right then.
So you have, and I think a lot of people sort of forget that this is, the year 2011, right? The iPhone has only been around for like 3 years at that point. Social media was really just it's like the dawn of social media there. So you had like Twitter had just kind of arrived on the scene. Facebook was around for a little bit. I think the story like caught fire, and I was shocked at how fast
where were
it
you?
took
Do you
on.
remember what you were doing when the presentment came down?
No,
because we were clued in that we knew something was going to bust for over a year.
Yeah.
And Sarah actually wrote a story on March 31st, 2011, that got no traction at all.
Yeah.
That Jerry was being investigated.
I was watching TV at home. It came on ABC News.
And it was a Saturday. It was an
didn't
off
see it
week for
coming.
Penn State. It was a Saturday.
Yep. Yeah. So the game had, I think, whatever game I was watching had just ended, and they went to the news, and that's when the news dropped, and my heart sank right away. And then I was just amazed, like I said, at how fast the story, took off. Anyway,
You were still at ESPN at the time?
I was no, I was not. I think I was at. I was at Consumer Reports, actually, where I am now. So
yeah. I don't know if you made it. Chris was an editor at ESPN, the magazine, for a long time, which is a completely different entity than the ESPN broadcast entity, and even a different entity than ESPN.com, who a lot of my friends have worked for.
Yep.
I don't really know anybody on the TV side at all, and many of you guys didn't know any of those people all that well, did you?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I knew some of them. I knew the guys who kind of covered this nationally. I knew some of the guys that were sort of talking about what they saw and what they would have done, I think, and that was a difficult thing for me to do. A lot of people kind of talked about how they would have responded if they kind of saw this, if they knew this, and I think it's easy to kind of do that from, your living room in a way. But I think if you, as I've said, if you work for any company, any major corporation, and you witness something, the first thing they tell you to do is not go and call the police. The first thing they tell you to do is go to the human resources department, right, or report it to your manager, and then they take it from there. So I don't know what happened, along the chain. And I should say, also just I made a conscious decision not to start this book in 2011 because a lot of this, because I don't think we'll ever know who knew what. And I didn't want to spend my 3 years, 2 years sort of reporting and writing this, sort of trying to dig into the
It's been done ad nauseum
yes.
anyway.
Yes.
I mean, I think you made a good decision in starting the book in 2012.
So the story that really kind of pulled me in was the story of those student athletes, right? Those players that kind of stood up. In part because I sort of admired what they did on the field, but I think, more than that, it was just, I kept waiting for the grown-ups to come out, right, and say, hey, wait, this is spiraling out of control, the news that's here, somebody's got to kind of stand up and say, wait a second, we got to wait until we have all the facts here, right, until we know what happened. And that never came from the administration, that never came from the athletic department, that never came from the board of trustees. It was really those student athletes that kind of stood up there and said, hey, we're not going anywhere. And so I had this amazing 2012 season, which was, inspiring, just the way that they, pulled through after losing the first 2 games of the season. I knew that the book was going to end with this awesome 2016 season, when they became this just glorious come from behind team, some of the greatest offense I've ever seen in a Penn State team. And I had to go and say, is there a way to kind of stitch those two things together? What do I write about? The middle of the book is all about, 2013, 2014, and 2015. And there were some fireworks in there. There's the 4 overtime game against Michigan, but there's also a lot of sort of heartache and a lot of sort of losing that happens in that stretch.
I just got done reading the book this week. And you can crack it open anywhere, which is the great part about the way Chris wrote it. There are little, I guess you'd call them vignette transitions that you write in italics, but then you'll get rapid fire quotes with the person's name. A lot of them are players. And you can crack the book open anywhere and enjoy it because you know exactly where you are in the whole sequence. But one of the most interesting parts of the book to me were the things that Christian Hackenberg said. And I know he is not considered like a hero around Penn State circles, but he should be.
Yeah.
He should be considered an absolute hero. And there was stuff in there that you got out of him that I don't think he said to anybody, which to me was worth buying the book right there. It was really heartfelt, and he got the crap beat out of him, that kid, basically for the decision to stay. And he didn't, he could have bailed. He never had to come in the first place because by the time he committed to Bill O'Brien, the sanctions were known. He not completely, but it was known that I believe that the NCAA was going to come down with a hammer if not that.
Yeah, he had committed, and he was coming back from a football camp with his dad when he heard on the news that the sanctions had been. He
could have gotten out of it very easily. He did not. He could have transferred very easily after getting. The 2015 line was just not fit to protect him, and he was not a mobile quarterback. He really got the crap knocked out of him. I believe he led the nation in sacks absorbed in 2015. Certainly led the Big Ten.
Yep.
Anyway, when you get a quarterback like that, that's a pro-style quarterback, and he gets no protection, sacked 10 times against Temple. It takes a toll. People say, well, he was getting happy feet. He was moving around a lot. You would too. It gives you, I call it quarterback PTSD because that's really what it is. And if you've been a quarterback, you know you need to get set and you have to throw. And I was a quarterback like that. I was an immobile quarterback and we ran a wishbone. And so I didn't throw that much. But when I did, I was kind of a mechanical throw it back, and I could wing it. But in order to do that, you have to have clearance with your front foot and with your arm moving forward, because the worst thing that you can do is hit your fingers on a helmet. It hurts like hell. Sometimes you don't break your fingers, you just stove them, and then they hurt the rest of the game. And he was getting this stuff. He never got clearance up the middle, and he would just stand there and throw into the teeth of free rushers constantly.
Yep.
I just think the book really illustrates how beat up he was, but not because he's whining about it. He's not. He's not.
That's right. I mean, I would love to say that it was my, genius questioning
Well, you
that
did
sort of
something.
drew that out of him.
You did something, because
I
I've never,
knew,
I've
going
never,
in that
yeah.
the middle of the book was going to be like really focused on Christian Hackenberg, because I think at the end of the day, he's the person that paid the largest price for what Jerry Sandusky did. The sanctions that came down, as Dave said, he came to the he could have walked away, and he decided to come to the program. And as the #1 quarterback recruit in the country, he had a awesome freshman season under Bill O'Brien.
Under a guy who was perfect for him,
Right.
Bill O'Brien, a pro-style quarterback coach. And then he takes off after that season, because Bill had already been there. OB had already been there for Matt McGloin.
That's right.
So he only had one season with Hackenberg, and that was the reason he came. He still stayed.
And he could have left.
He
His
could have
dad
left
wanted
then.
him to go.
Yeah.
He was like,
He
no,
could have
I'm
left
staying.
then.
That's
he
right.
still stayed with a coach who really was not suited to his skills.
Right. And I think that's a testament to like what a lot of those guys that stayed in those, middle years talked about. It was more than football for them. I think it was more than wins and losses. It really was about that, sort of preserving the program. It became kind of a mission for them to stay together. But, I did, when I had the chance to kind of interview Christian Hackenberg, it was funny actually, because I'm from Scranton, Pennsylvania, so that's where Matt McGloin is from. Thank you very much. I reached out to Matt early on, did not hear back from Matt. I had a friend from ESPN who called me right after he saw that I had the book deal and said, would you like to talk to Trace McSorley? And I was like, yeah, I would love to talk to Trace McSorley.
Yeah.
And he's like, I just ran into his dad at the pizza place. I live in Virginia. He's a neighbor. I'll talk to him. And then I was able to kind of reach out to Christian Hackenberg, and he agreed. So I was surprised that I got 2 of the 3 quarterbacks right away. It was not the one that I expected. And midway through my interview with Christian, I was thinking I'm going to have to ask him this question now about his relationship with James Franklin. I'm going to have to ask him about, the turmoil that was there. And I never had to do that. He actually just came forward and started talking about it himself when I asked him to kind of share his story with me.
I remember talking to him, and it was pretty clear. The writing was on the wall. He was out to shoot, because he'd been through 2 years under an offense that really wasn't suited to him, with a couple of zone read guys. And he was ready to go to the NFL, but he hadn't said so. And after the game, which was the Gator Bowl, except they called it something else back then.
The Tax Slayer Bowl, I think that's what they call it. That's right.
The tax, in Jacksonville. And if you recall, they got behind 24-3, and then Christian got hurt late in the second quarter. He really messed up. What did he mess up? His knee. Yeah, I think, right? Shoulder.
Yeah, shoulder. That's what it was, the shoulder, because he wasn't able to throw.
And he was done. He had a separated shoulder. And so that's when Trace McSorley came in, and this was the first we'd seen Trace, and we're going, wow, this is great. So it was really Trace's show, and it was Trace's coming out. And after the game, Christian just came out with it. As you said in the book, they were not going to plan it that way.
Right.
Penn State likes to dot all its I's and cross all its T's with everything it does. And they like to be very organized in how they disseminate information, which is what we don't want. I was right in front of him, and I stayed in front of him just in case. And a couple of people walked away. Like, he's not going to say anything. And
Right.
I happened to get it, and then I stayed while he thanked everybody. everybody except James
James
Franklin,
Franklin.
which I thought was interesting. But that's not the Christian Hackenberg that comes through in this book. I think
No.
the kid that came through in the book was not a kid anymore. He was a grown man.
That's right.
With a very mature outlook, not only on the present, but on who he was as a 21-year-old kid.
Yes.
And that is another great part of the book, because he's reflecting from the perspective of a grown man on how he felt at the time. And you can completely understand it, but he was a different person back then.
Yes. Yes, and I think he very easily could have viewed it the way that I was. He's paid the largest price, and this was a tragedy that his NFL career didn't sort of pan out.
I thought all his responses were very mature.
I was really impressed. I mean, he basically said, at that point there was no way he was going to sort of walk away from Penn State. He had given his word. He was leading those players. He was, part of the sort of Penn State community. And even though his dad was saying you got to go and other people were saying you got to walk, he said that just would not have been me, right? To kind of to walk away from the commitment that I had made to the school and to those players at that time. And he doesn't, he talks a little bit about, I think, the difficult transition for James Franklin. And to be fair, Bill O'Brien comes in. Those guys were desperate for somebody to come in and sort of coach that team after Paterno was gone. I think they, quickly gathered and rallied sort of behind Bill O'Brien. I think when James Franklin comes in, it's a very different story there. You don't have the, Bill O'Brien had a team that was loaded with NFL talent that was there, a very talented roster still. James Franklin didn't have that. That's when the scholarships reductions really started to hurt the team. We didn't have an offensive line for his first 3 years there. And I think he came in thinking I'm going to be, I'm going to take over like any coach would, right? You're going to kind of put your own stamp on the program. But the difference there is that these guys, for 2 seasons before that had stepped forward and it was their program, right? They were the ones that said, we're going to rescue this program. And I think Bill O'Brien gave them a lot of latitude to kind of say, here's what we want to do, right? He kind of took the names off the uniforms on their behalf.
Put their names on the backs.
That's right.
To honor them.
That's right. I'm sorry, put the names on the back, right.
And Bill was a perfect coach for that time.
Yep.
And then I thought Franklin became the perfect coach for his time. People talk about a guy that gets all sorts of crap. It's Dave Joyner.
Yes.
He's an athletic director who picked both of those guys. So do with that what
Nebraska's still trying to find the guy that replaces Tom Osborne. Joyner hired 2 coaches right in the footsteps of Joe Paterno and got it right both times, I think. So I wasn't sure if I stopped you there. You were going to sort of talk a little bit more about James Franklin. That's great. Yep. I was going to ask if anybody in the audience had questions for us. We're happy to kind of take some.
If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. I'll come around with a mic so everyone can hear.
All right. Jeanette has a question.
I was wondering how hard it was for you to set up interviews with the players. Were a lot of them reluctant to speak to you? And also if there was some bitterness that they felt, did that come out when you talked to them?
Right. I will say off the bat, there's no bitterness. I did not get that from them at all. That was one of the things that I was sort of scared of, and that's part of the reason why I decided to tell this book in an oral history format, because these guys didn't know me. I hadn't, covered Penn State football in more than 30 years. I knew some of the people who had covered the program because some of the guys that I was on the collegiate with were still sort of covering the program. So they were able to introduce me, but really, they don't know me. They had been burned by the national media, I think, in 2011. So they really had to kind of trust me to tell their stories. And I was really surprised at how willing they were to come forward. I started with a lot of the guys that were like walk-ons. And then somebody was actually able to set me up with Craig Fitzgerald, who was the strength coach under Bill O'Brien. And then I think I got to talk to Spider Caldwell, who's been the equipment manager for Penn State since I was there. And I think those guys were able to kind of say, hey, he's legit. You know, he wants to kind of tell your story. And he's somebody that's going to sort of take care with that story. And I think that's what really opened the door. Some of these guys, I was literally using LinkedIn. I was literally like taking, because these guys are not playing pro football. You know, most of these guys have moved on to kind of the working world. And I was able to kind of just send that little tiny message you could send saying like, hey, I'm a Penn State grad. It was amazing what I had to kind of squeeze into that little tiny space. Penn State grad, cover the team, want to do this book, oral history, all your voice. Please respond. And I was surprised at the number. I think it was 60 people that I interviewed by the end of the book. And then because it was an oral history, I was actually able to go in and mine the transcripts from press conferences. A lot of the sports writers now will actually take video of interviews that are happening in the locker room, on the sidelines, and they would post those on YouTube. A lot of the players had podcasts, so I sort of mined those podcasts. My thinking was I didn't want to go back and use a newspaper story that somebody else had sort of composed. I wanted to hear the players speaking myself, so I could confirm that that was their sentiment, that was their story. I could hear the intonations in it and know what they were emphasizing, what they weren't. And so I mined all of that stuff to kind of try and put the story together.
And you got some guys that, if you're a reporter, you don't always interview the stars. In fact, a lot of times you don't want to interview the stars because they're kind of on a treadmill, a loop of comments. When you're one of those guys, you get so tired of being interviewed that you're on a loop of comments that you've used over and over and over and over. But you've got guys like Zanolato,
Matt Zanolato.
Matt Zanolato's got great quotes in there.
Yeah.
I don't think I interviewed him once, but I mean, I should have. There's a lot of insight from guys who you may not even have heard of, but they were there. They were in the locker room, and they have things to say, and they were great things to say. They were very interesting, illuminating things to say.
I started with walk-ons because those were the guys, that I thought I had the best chance with. But at the end of the day, the thing that I learned was that those are the guys, they didn't have a spot on the team. They were trying to earn their spot on the team. And then when Bill O'Brien leaves, they actually have to earn it all over again under James Franklin. So those guys saw the entire football field. The guys that were starters and in positions, they knew their own unit, right? They hung out together. It was the walk-ons that kind of had to see what was happening on the entire field. And so they had more to say. They saw more, I think, than some of those star players would.
And one of the issues with Franklin's first couple of teams, as you kind of touched on, is in 2014 and 2015, he's got guys from 3 different regimes there. He's got Joe Paterno guys, he's got Bill O'Brien guys, he's got his own guys, and some of them weren't bought in. They weren't. Some of them were just fatigued of buying into a new guy. I mean, if you count interim coaches,
5. There were 5.
Scrap.
That they had.
Tom Bradley.
Yep.
Was Larry Johnson the coach?
Larry Johnson was in between.
So you got all these different guys. They were fatigued, and not only that, but Bill O'Brien and James Franklin are 2 very different coaches in just about every way. Yep. Even though they coached on the same staff at Maryland for 2 years. One quote that I thought was very interesting from another guy, I don't remember who it was, but it was not a well-known player at all, is he regretted the fact that he didn't buy in long enough to see the fruits.
That's right.
And he admitted it. Who was it?
Yeah, I think that was Zanolato.
That was Zanolato?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And he admitted thinking when they won it all in 2016.
He asked Trace McSorley, like, what happened? And he said, we bought in. We all bought in.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And
Matt's a coach now, so he was kind of saying, that's a good lesson for me.
And then Matt said, damn, but you can't blame the kid,
No.
It was just a lot of fatigue, a lot of mental
question
fatigue.
there in the back, I think. Yep.
Yeah, great. I wonder if you had a chance to talk to those that left the team. I remember the running back that went to USC and what their perspective is with time about their decisions.
Yeah.
Silas Red's a big part of this. Yeah.
I did not have a chance to kind of, and it came more down to timing. I had to kind of produce a book in 2 years, so I had kind of like 9 months to sort of do as much interviewing as I possibly could. But Silas read two things. There's, I don't know if you've seen the documentary Saving the Roar on the 2012 season. Silas is a big part of that because he agreed to actually talk to them. And he, I don't want to spoil it, but at the end, he's like in tears basically talking about what that was like for him to kind of walk away from the program at that time and how much playing for Paterno meant to him, how much being a member of that team meant to him. And then he did a podcast, I think it was with Adam Brenneman. And that was another, he talked about walking in, and this is like in those hours after the sanctions came down. Bill O'Brien invited a bunch of lettermen back to campus to kind of talk to the players about what Penn State meant to them. And in the hours before that happened, Silas Redd went in to Bill O'Brien and said, I'm leaving, I'm going to USC, and then walked out of the football building and never had a chance to say goodbye to his teammates and others. He went back and had dinner with his roommates and then went back to his apartment and started packing his things and broke down in tears in that moment. Like, that's how difficult that and gut-wrenching that decision was for him. So I actually, after I heard that, I was like, I actually have to do a chapter that's just about the guys that left and the reasons that those guys left. And I hope it gets a little bit at what you're talking about, that reflection.
Anthony Farah, the punter who left for Texas.
Yes, Anthony Farah.
His mother had, what was her issue? I can't remember.
She had like a form of cancer, I believe. So he left to kind of be closer to her in Texas.
That was a great part of why he left.
Yep.
Hi. In your interview with the players, did any of them share their feelings about how Joe was treated by the university?
Yes, it did come up. And this was a thing that I wanted to get at because I was trying to explain to people why people in Pennsylvania had so much faith in Joe Paterno, I think, why the passion was there. And I, was telling the people that I knew in New York, I grew up in Scranton, right? I grew up in coal country. I know a lot of the kids that I went to school with grew up in steel country, right? The people in Philadelphia, a lot of them kind of relied on the Navy yards there. We basically live in a state where the industry has been on decline for my entire lifetime, at least. Joe Paterno gives people in this state, or gave people in this state, like a point of pride, right, in the success that his teams have. But not just that, the fact that he made the books part of it so important, right? The fact that he wanted the university to build a library that you could be proud of. He gave the people in this state, he stepped forward and became a moral arbiter, I guess, for people in this state. And when I took a look at that, there aren't a lot of politicians that kind of have taken that role here in Pennsylvania. I was trying to think about writers that might have filled that role, and there really was nobody. So I think it goes like well beyond what happens on the football field, and I certainly had that reinforced when I talked to the players. I was surprised at just the number of kids that didn't even grow up in Pennsylvania kind of talked about what Paterno meant to their parents and to their grandparents. And I think I especially, a lot of the black players, African-American players also talked about the fact that he was kind of like a father figure to them and the fact that he saw them as way more than just football players and athletes, right? He wanted to kind of leave them, round them out as men. He told them time and again that it was, their football careers were going to end at some point, and you actually had to have a career and a life after that, right? So he kind of pressed them to do that, and that was really meaningful to them. So I think they felt like he didn't get his fair shake at the end, but I think they also understood the circumstances that were there. I think that story was just getting hotter and hotter by the day, and so, they understood. They just felt it was a great tragedy that he had to leave under the circumstances that he did. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah,
There's going to be one over here after that. Yep.
You mentioned that other colleges were trying to recruit the athletes away.
Yes.
Were there any former players who were trying to implore them to stay, like the LeVar Arringtons of the world and people like that?
I think you had the Letterman come back, and that's why they sort of had this event that Bill invited Letterman to come back, asked him to come back in a moment's notice, and there were like 300 Lettermen that came back. There were more than could even speak. I mean, they had 5 speakers there, and there were a lot of guys that were huge names at Penn State that were like just in the audience, kind of clapping people on the back. So that's what, and the Letterman, the thing you have to understand, I didn't realize this until I kind of reported the book, but the fact that Joe Paterno was there for 50 years meant that those players that played for him for 50 years all had the exact same experience. And that's why that Letterman group is so powerful at Penn State, because it's not like, now you have 3 different coaches that they've played for, but for 50 years, it was all those guys went through the same thing. So you had guys like Michael Motti and Michael Zordich, whose dads had been through that, that process before. So I thought that really struck me, that notion of why that Letterman club would be so big and so strong. But they were really, it was Michael Motti and Michael Zordich, as I kind of detail in the book, that came forward and really sort of tried to rally those guys. They came back and forth between Craig Fitzgerald's office and Bill O'Brien's office with a yellow legal pad, and they were literally going like player by player. If this guy goes, we're going to lose these 3. If this guy goes, we're going to lose these 4. If we get this guy, we can keep these guys here. And there was like, probably 72 hours of them just literally reaching out to players, to their parents, to their girlfriends, to anybody they could to sort of try and convince those guys to stay. And some phone calls that were made to players who were like on the way to Michigan State, to kind of see what that program was like. They were on the phone to those guys saying, you got to turn around and come back here. We got to hold this together. Yep.
Sort of a layperson regarding football. However, the question that keeps coming up in my mind is, with the turmoil that was evident there, and they weren't allowed with the sanctions to go to the play in the bowls. Presumably they were still allowed to win their divisions or whatever, but how do you motivate young men who have this one shot to make it and then make it to the pros in the midst of so much uncertainty?
Yep.
So did you come up with anything about how they did that and how they imparted? I mean, I'm hearing how much Penn State meant to them, but somebody just going to Penn State,
Right.
17 or 18, 19-year-old, where did they get it? How did they motivate them?
That's it. I think and Dave saw a lot of this sort of firsthand, so I'll kind of let him follow up because he saw a little bit more of what Bill O'Brien was doing. I think the thing that kept coming up in my interviews with them was you had a group of like high character guys that were there, and that is a credit, I think, to the kind of recruiting that Joe Paterno did. But they were there for more than just football. They really firmly believed in what that program stood for, and they enough to kind of want to stay. And for that 2012 class of seniors that really, gets held up in very high regard, and deservedly so, they said to me, we had one more season to go. Where were we going to go? Our best friends were there on campus, right? We had all of these credits from there. So we weren't going to turn around and leave, right away. It was those sort of freshmen and sophomores and juniors that actually had to commit to being there for 2, 3, or 4 years. And they were able to convince them. I'll ask Dave that question, though, too, because you were there to kind of see what the Bill O'Brien year was like.
In 2012, the answer is Bill O'Brien. He had a powerful personality, and he spoke from the gut. James Franklin's very good at what he does, but he's a psychology major in college.
That's right.
And he crafts his message. He plans his messages. And it's not that he doesn't care about the players. I believe he really does. He gets very emotional sometimes, but I've only seen him crack through that facade once, and that was after the 2018 Ohio State game, where he just cracked, and in the press conference he lost it. I've only seen him lose it once, Bill O'Brien lost it all the time. And he lost it with me on the phone many times because I talked to him a lot on the phone. And he was a lot like me. I lose my temper very easily. And, there were times where, yeah, you're full of crap. No, you're full of crap. And back and forth. We understood each other. And there's a genuineness there that kids who are bereaved and looking for somebody, looking for a safe harbor, he gave them that. And they didn't need a bowl game. They needed a unified middle finger at the world, and he gave them that. He felt as he was blindsided by the NCAA sanctions and Mark Emmert as much as anyone. He took the job in January of 2012, never expecting that to come down in July. So he felt that bitterness as much as anybody. Until I started hearing about what I got a very good source about the sanctions. I was the Comcast Sportsnet, now NBC Sports Philadelphia, had put me up in the Holiday Inn overnight for the sanctioned announcement from the NCAA the next morning. So I would be in the studio at 9 a.m. to react to it. And I did a show that night. I went back to had been in the Holiday Inn at the sports complex in Philadelphia for about an hour when I got the call that informed me exactly what the sanctions were going to be. I came that close to calling OB because I wasn't sure he knew. And I'm not sure I didn't know. I'm sure I knew within a few minutes of when he knew. I'm not positive I didn't know before he knew. But I thought, no, I got to stay out of this. He's gonna find out. That would just be showing off. But I actually had to revise what I said on the air so I didn't out my source, because he had it exactly right and I knew he did because I knew his sourcing was impeccable. And even I couldn't believe it. I'd been warned, I think, by Emmert's posture the week before, if you remember him, kind of the Bantam Rooster about we're gonna step on these guys was his. But even I was a little bit shocked at how severe they were. So if I was shocked, you can imagine the players in OB. So they carried. Bill O'Brien was the perfect coach to get them motivated in that situation. James Franklin might not have been. He was great for rebranding the program later. It was perfect for that. But Bill O'Brien that's what did it. Bill O'Brien carried them through the next 2 years. And to Chris's point, the real pain of the sanctions didn't come down until 2014 when Franklin was the coach. Then's when you really needed the motivation. Then's when Christian Hackenberg needed the motivation, because he's in under siege behind center. He's getting free rushers coming in, and I know what that's like at a much lower level of football. I can't even imagine the guys he had hitting him. My nephew was the quarterback at Maryland and went through much the same thing when he transferred from Virginia Tech to Maryland and had free rushers just pouring in on him. He had 2 different concussions. It's grim. That's when you need the motivation. It was actually 2014 and 2015,
That's right.
I think more
Because
so.
Ohio State and Michigan still had their full scholarship caps.
and they had a bowl game because Mitchell was kind of on, who was the what did they call him? What was his what was Mitchell's title?
Oh yeah, he was
envoy or something like that. Or NCAA.
Senator Mitchell agreed to sort of come on and be the guy that monitored. He was like the official monitor.
That's what it was.
Right.
It was monitor.
The official monitor.
And
of the
so
program.
he was thinking this is bullshit from the get-go, and I was getting a lot of calls that Mitchell was really on Penn State's side, and before the end of that season in 2014, the sanctions on the Bulls were going to be lifted, and sure enough, they were. But that didn't help those guys in 2014.
That's right.
The bowl game against Boston College did not help them getting their brains beaten in. They still needed help. And the sanctions were the reason the sanctions had really come into effect, because all that class was juniors now, and there's sophomores and juniors.
That's right.
And it was empty.
Yeah.
It was kind of empty.
When
especially
James came
along
in,
the
there were a
line.
lot of true freshmen that were sort of playing, and a lot of those guys that
A
were
lot
sort of stars
offensive-
later on.
A lot of offensive linemen should not have been playing.
Yeah.
We are running out of time, so this will be our last question.
Okay.
Hey, Chris, Penn State class of 87 as well. So,
All right.
we know Marty and Zordich were obviously very strong leaders with the whole thing. Of the players you interviewed, who else impressed you with their leadership skills, maybe somebody you weren't expecting?
Well, I think, Trace McSorley, like later on, and Christian Hackenberg, so like just the way that those guys talked about the program, how meaningful it was. I didn't feel like they were pulling any punches. And I went in like, I wasn't looking for this to be a sordid story. I basically said, like, there's enough here, drama in the story. I just want to know what you guys saw. I want to know your stories. So those guys really kind of stood out. I mean, I was reporting this in the midst of the pandemic. So I was, working remotely from home, like I'm sure all of you were. And the news, as you may recall, was not always delightful. It was nothing delightful during that stretch. So I would work at like Consumer Reports during the day and then have an interview with these guys at night. And I got to the point where I was really looking forward to it because they were so thoughtful. They were so smart. And they really were kind of just opening up to me about what that whole experience was like. And, for all the difficulty that you had, I think, on the field, and some of those struggles, there were still some really tight, really genuine bonds that these guys had in playing together. And that came through. They talk about, to this day, one of those players gets married and, 20 guys from the team sort of go and show up at those marriages, right? At those weddings. They're there when the kids are born. They're there when these guys get a new job. So those bonds are really tight with those players. And that really came through. I didn't get to talk to everybody, at the end of the day. Saquon's a guy I would have been interested to talk to. The guy that I really wish I had had a chance to talk to was Carl Nassib, because his story was also so remarkable. I mean, talk about, a walk-on that actually had Bill O'Brien basically told him he would, he told him he wanted to play in the
Never
NFL,
play.
and he said he would never play in the
You got to worry.
Told him to
Said
get
you got
down
to
on
worry
the
about
road.
playing at Penn State.
That's it. So I talked to sort of people, some kids from Nittany Nation, and they talked about when the players would come up and bring them pizzas, and Carl Nassib actually stayed there one whole night afterwards and played cards with these guys to the end. They were like, why is Carl Nassib here playing cards with us? That's just the kind of guy that he was.
I got to
think.
say, when I was reading this, there's several people I never talked to, but I was thinking, I covered a lot of college football, a lot of college athletics. I think what always shined through with Penn State kids is they were interesting kids. They were curious minds. They were a certain brand of kids that you didn't find anywhere else in the league. Maybe Michigan.
Right.
Illinois is a really good school, but I never felt like the football program reflected that. Northwestern, Michigan, Penn State kids. If you interview those kids, most of them are going to have something on their mind. And that shines through in the book because you had several guys I'm sure I never talked to who were terrific quotes, who were thoughtful kids and had thought over this whole situation and had stories to tell, had things to say.
Yes, and it reinforced that idea that I had of the program, that whole notion of success with honor, that came through loud and clear. I think when I talked to those kids, I hadn't interviewed players in 35 years. So.
You wouldn't get a lot of those kids from Ohio State.
There you go, Ohio State crowd right there.
Industrial
Taking
design, OSU, 1983.
Well, thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Can we give one more round of applause for
All right.
Chris and David?
Dave Jones goes back into retirement. Thank you so much for coming out.
Back in the cave.